So, Steve, welcome to the podcast. Delighted to have you.
Great to be with you, Dirk, on this podcast. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining because I tremendously like your book, and I would love to share, let's say, the learnings and insights, at least that I captured from it, with the audience.
Yes.
Um, I think my first and probably a very provocative question would be is why did you title your book Why Great Leaders Ask Great Questions rather than Why Great Leaders Give Great Answers, which I think
Mm.
is the expectation that we have from leaders, right? They know the answer, they should know their stuff, they should have superior knowledge, superior insights, and they should be able to lead us. So why would they ask great questions?
Yes. Well, why did I title it that? Well, actually, two things. My working title was The Best Leaders Ask the Best Questions. But my publisher and my editor said, actually, let's make it a different title, Why Great Leaders Ask Great Questions. So that's the very direct answer to your question.
Yeah.
So there it is, Why Great Leaders Ask Great Questions. Um, but your provocative title about answers is interesting in that um, there is no such thing as easy answers, and I think we actually conflate leadership with authority, and they're two quite different things for me. Authority is about the process needs for protection, direction, and order, and in that dynamic. Then answers are an important part of that. But actually, leaders are asking a different question. Leaders are asking what adaptations are necessary in my organization or team to thrive. Now, that can start as an individual quest, but I believe it has to become a community activity to thrive. And so I think leadership is also a community activity. It's a process, it's a action, it's a verb, not a noun. And so I think in the complexity of the modern world, leaders actually are fueling greater productivity by asking questions. That's my fundamental piece there. But let's talk about answers for a minute because they're important as well. I think they are in the domain of authority and not leadership. Now,
Hmm.
in organizations, let's just this wonderful phrase, the C-suite. They're authority figures who may or may not exercise leadership. A rhetorical question for yourself and your listeners: have you ever met an authority figure, a CEO or a senior vice president, who's not exercised leadership? Likewise, have you ever met someone who has no official title exercise leadership? It
Yeah.
happens all over the place.
And
So that's
I
why I
think,
got into
yeah,
the questions piece. Yeah.
yeah. No, but I think that's an excellent notion in the sense that, and I also recognize it when you say it. We identify them with each other. We identify that people, let's say, with authority have leadership, and we also generally assume that people who are leaders basically have authority, formal authority. But I think you're absolutely right. They could be actually, and they are, as a matter of fact, quite often decoupled.
Mm. I think so a lot of the time, and that's where a lot of problems and confusion arises. Yeah.
Yeah. Steve, you say that the best leaders can only ask the best questions if they know two things. First of all, how they reflect. And secondly, how to build a reflective practice that works for them. To start with the first element,
Mm.
how can leaders discover if and how they reflect?
Yes. Well, I think it's foundational, and let me precede that by I spend a lot of time listening and working with executive groups, and I'm very influenced by the work of Ed Shine and the whole process consultation work. And actually, I spend a lot of my time being deeply disappointed by the quality of questions from the C-suite. And the reason for my disappointment is that most of their questions are about them and about their ego needs, and often their ego needs to reinforce that they are the authority figure. And so let's hold that there. And then I've looked at, in my view, the most effective leaders, and they all seem to have one thing in common. They know themselves quite well. And so this goes back to a, deep philosophy of, Socrates quoting Plato around the unexamined life is not worth living, is the kind of quote from many hundreds of years ago. And so my starting point is a question, and my book focuses on it's sort of twofold. It's general, but it's incredibly specific. So I ask people in the first person, how do I reflect? And I often ask that question without any run up or explanation. I just ask them to journal how they reflect, and we get a variety of answers. But in order to reflect, you then know yourself, and actually to ask good questions in the moment, you have to be better and better and better reflecting so you can reflect in the midst of action. And that's the dynamic I want to help people with. And I think slow down to speed up, understand how you reflect. And the more you understand how you reflect, you will ask better questions because you're standing back from that sometimes psychological anxiety of, I need to reinforce my authority status in this sales meeting. Well, I'm not sure that's right. But the better question comes from an art of reflection. But we can unpack that a bit more, but I'll come back to you, Dirk, on that because I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on.
Yeah, I think so. I think so because you also work with a number of leaders, and you have worked throughout your career with a number of leaders. Because, as a matter of fact, leadership development, I think, is one of the biggest red threads throughout your
Yes.
professional career. What answers do you typically get if you ask
Mm,
leaders, how they reflect? What are the typical
mhm,
answers do you get, or do you get
mhm.
sometimes no answers at all? I mean, what do you hear when you ask them?
Well, let's start with that one. I sometimes get, I don't reflect. This
Yeah,
has made me question how I do because actually everybody does.
yeah,
But the most typical answer I then get is not is a different question they've asked themselves, and the different question is, where do I reflect? So I'll often, for example, I'll be in a group setting with 10 senior leaders, and I'll say in your journal, ask, how do I reflect? And a typical discussion would go something like this. Oh, when I'm cycling. Oh, when I'm in the shower. Oh, when I'm hill walking. And then I point out great answers, but you've answered a different question. Where do I reflect? The how is a different question altogether, and then takes almost another round because someone might help and say, oh, well, I use a journal, or I have three questions I ask myself, or I take an event and I do some sort of mental post-mortem on it afterwards. The other trait I come across a lot is a deeply held assumption that it's about improvement of some sort of weaknesses of what's happened in a particular project or moment, when actually very few people seem to reflect on celebrating success, which I find equally intriguing. I very rarely hear um, we launched this fantastic product. We then had a celebration, and I wanted to reflect of how we built X, Y, Z. So
yeah.
it tends to be quite self-critical. And then, and I think Jenny Moon said, um, I reflect in order to act, and I act as a result of reflection. So there's this sort of interplay with these two mental positions going on. Um, Now, there's also something very intriguing, and that's, a lot of, let's use that broad phrase of clever people. They get fantastically good at skilled defensiveness. So I also challenge a bit the deep self-interest of lots of time with their journal, making sense of the wonderful decision they made, where actually to take it a stage further, um, reflecting with critical friends or confidants or mentors is the next stage because it allows you to examine the assumptions you might have had about a particular project or moment in time. Again, how you reflect then gets into journaling or meditation or whatever it might be. I use journals extensively. There's many
Yeah, so do
lying around
I.
my
Yeah,
office.
yeah,
Um, the thing about my journals is I could never read my writing back. So it's kind of interesting that I kind of write it, sort of remember it at the time, look back at that scribble and think, oh yeah, that was that session 2 weeks ago, and it sort of builds this little memory. But it's pretty illegible, and but it's whatever works for you. Some people have
yeah,
this very neat thing with tiny little Polaroid photographs and quotes from poetry or literature.
yeah.
Fantastic if it works for you. Um, could I say one more thing about reflection? And
Please,
you
yeah,
might ask me later about the Oxford Executive Leadership Program, which I'm the lucky to be the head tutor on. That program is 8 weeks, and I came across some research, I think, from the King's Fund that it takes 8 weeks to build a habit. And I actually now on that program say, look, even if you don't journal, try it for 8 weeks and see if it sticks. The amount of notes I get on LinkedIn for people say, I never used to have a reflective practice. The journal is now my number one important book. And again, we won't delve into neuroscience on this session, but the art of writing it down is a physical act. So it's
yeah,
easier to remember and easier to recall than just recording a voice note. But I don't get obsessive about that. I just say to people, work with whatever works for you. And some reflection is better than no reflection.
yeah. And what I love, you used the statement skilled defensiveness.
Yes,
Can you a little bit?
yes,
That sounds
yeah.
intriguing. Can you expand a little bit on that notion, Steve?
Well, I think the workplace and the workplace is full of theatre, isn't it? And particularly as you are more senior in the organization, the theatre is richer. And so people are constantly managing self justification and self defense routines. And I think so. I sort of sometimes, and this comes from, Jungian archetypes. There's always the dark side.
Yeah,
So the dark side of
shadow.
constantly journaling is that you might justify these outrageous autocratic tendencies you have, and you justify it to yourself to then be better. But then debriefing that with someone close enough to it, but not so close to it, I think helps mitigate that skill defensiveness.
Yeah,
We see it all the time in organizations.
yeah. And if a leader, you already said a few words around, let's say the reflective practice.
Yeah.
But if a leader basically comes to you and say, "Look, I actually realize I should do this more,"
Yes.
what would you recommend to them?
I believe in the whole idea of mini experiments. And there's a good colleague of mine at Side Business School, Mark Clark, and he has this wonderful suggestion he shares, which is the 1 minute reflection. And I think it's three questions. And he said, just find the time. In fact, you can do it in 20 seconds. When did I lead today? When could I have led, but I didn't? And what did I learn most today? And just put them down as bullet points. And he said, and then close your journal. And the time I've taken to say that is almost the time you could do that and then close the journal. So it challenges this number one excuse, I don't have time, which again I hear frequently, but try Mark's 1 minute journal technique and then guess what happens? People do it and they write a little bit more in a margin and then a bit more, and before they know it, it's 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Now, it's also an interesting notion because I tried to, several times in my life to start journaling. And September last year, so September 2025, I started again because I just had an idea. Look, I need to capture those thoughts. I need to
Yes.
capture these things. And I basically started indeed, in one of these journal books. And the interesting thing in the beginning it felt a little bit like a chore, and I only wrote down, let's say, the highly necessary items. But currently, if I don't fill my journal or don't update my journal, it's almost like I have withdrawal symptoms. So there is indeed an element that, not only do you kind of, basically adopt it as a habit, but it's also something that you really get attached to.
Absolutely. And there's also the whole therapy world talks about journaling in terms of, really tough times because it gets it out there into a third party, which is the journal, the ink
Yeah.
on the paper. It's actually physically getting it outside of you. So then you can look at it perhaps in a very different way. So, and for me, this is about the whole concept of agency. It's
Hmm.
emotional servers. The workplace can be an emotional place, but not being just imprisoned by them, but making a choice, but a choice in a microsecond, a choice when there's anger or frustration, just to hold back with your anger and slightly reframe it, I think gives you the edge as a leader because any good leader is constantly asking three questions. And I take them from Ellen Langer at Harvard. What's going on? What else is going on? What's really going on? And those three questions, whenever I run a group, executive board off site, they're just running around my head all the time. Why did we laugh at that joke that the senior person said? Why didn't we laugh when someone seemed to make a really edgy comment? Why did that person look distracted? I'm constantly asking me self questions as well, because I think I can serve groups better by um, observing the micro.
Hmm. Yeah. Both you and I worked a lot in the finance industry, and as a matter of
Yes.
fact, in my executive coaching practice, I currently coach a number of executives from that particular industry. And but I just wonder. I mean, these industries are tremendously high paced.
Hmm.
People make tremendously long hours. They're asked to serve, let's say, as constant decision making machines. Um, what would you recommend to leaders working in that particular industry to introduce
Yes.
a kind of, reflection change dynamic without slowing down execution?
Mm. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? On the one hand, I can agree with your assumption about financial services. On the other, it's a myth that they keep creating around this decision making. I think there's a ton of other time in financial institutions which is deeply reflective. And let's just talk about the long hours. There is a ritual in some of those cultures to
Yeah.
stay beyond the sort of contractual hours. And there's a different rhythm of work happens. There's one-to-one discussions, there's very informal corridor meetings. So in some senses, I'm not sure it's the productive nexus you argue it is, which means let's just disqualify the myth of time. There's always time if you want it. And even if I just take that one
It's
minute
it's a kind of
reflective,
choice whether you choose to
yes,
to create that
it
time and
is, it
space for
is,
you.
it
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
And I often see the people who say they don't have time actually been quite skilled at having quite a bit of time. So I think, how do you enter that conversation? I think they constantly are involved in sense making, particularly about markets. And, the poet David White says that, you know, the CEO is the chief storyteller. And in the best financial institutions, they are sense makers and telling the story of the market, aren't they, to their colleagues, peers around investment, about moving something away, etc. So um,
They make
that's how
sense
I
of
see
our
that.
environment. They make
Yeah, yeah,
sense
yeah,
of
of
our
course.
environment. Yeah, yeah.
And in the regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, I did some work with them a while back. They their whole role is the question of what's going on in their particular service sector of finance. Yeah.
Yeah.
The busiest places have reflective routines. You just have to use their language to get people to access them.
Hmm.
But but also in the culture of these places, you can sometimes enter a financial institution and people are walking between meetings fast. So there's almost a kind of energy expectation of walking nearly half running. And the greeting in the corridor isn't "How are you, Dirk?" It's the question "Busy?" question mark.
Yeah.
And your answer has to be
Very busy.
yeah, or
Yeah.
it's as busy, you've no idea. So then you get
Yeah.
into this wonderful
Yeah.
competition in the stairway, which then
Yeah.
colludes with this. We better be walking fast if we're busy, but
Yeah.
there is time, and we have to find our moments as Sherpas on the guide to helping organizations get better to access that time in a productive way.
Yeah, no, but I agree. No, and I think to a large extent, I mean, I hate that term, but to a large extent, is also it seems almost like a cultural problem because it's just what you say. People run between meetings,
Yes.
and saying that you're not busy is a bad thing.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you're not busy, then other people will make sure that you're busy. So
Hmm.
there is more culture. Let's create, loads of work. Let's do
Yes.
loads of activities rather than take a step back in the sense of,
Mm.
what are we
Well,
actually here to do and what might be, let's say,
well,
the best decision. It's like feeding the machine rather than stepping back and looking at the
yeah.
inner workings of the machine.
And you know what? I think that kind of culture is a culture colluding in huge work avoidance. And I'm so influenced by the work of Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. And that busy work is work avoidance. And whenever I mention and introduce the
Hmm.
concept of work avoidance in work that I do, people just assume it's lazy. Actually, most work avoidance is pretty tiring and very busy, but it's avoiding the real work. And I make the
Yeah,
distinction between are you working on or in the firm? And they're two very different postures. I think to really lead, you have to work on and, of course, in, but you're not going to lead unless you work on the firm, not in it, is my really big thing I constantly challenge executive groups on.
yeah, because it reminds me also on the analogy you use in your book in terms of the dance floor and the balcony. And
Yes.
it seems like a lot of leaders spend too much time on the dance floor, probably also because that might be easier to a large extent than going up to the balcony and do the hard work,
Of
if you understand what
course.
I mean. If I basically
Yeah.
answer 100 emails, then it's clear what I've done. If I basically thought long and hard about the future of my department,
Mm.
that's probably a lot more difficult.
Well, there's a lot more at stake, isn't there? And
Yeah.
I'm using Heifetz and Linsky's metaphor around balcony dance floor, which I think is so simple, but it's definitely not simplistic.
No.
And it really gets to that whole dynamic of what is the work? What is the real work? And I often start my sessions with a question to a group: what is the real work? Leave it there and then revisit it a couple of hours later when I've given them some tools of reflection. And the crucially important question: how do you spend your time as an executive? Because you're working many hours beyond the contract. So the only choice you have is how you spend your time. Some leaders spend it external to the organization, others are internal, others are very close to the dance floor where there's immediate gains and celebration. Others are taking a riskier role and working with the political, the social, the attitudinal to change um, the real work. And it's high stakes because you may not be popular in asking, how do we need to change what goes on around here?
Yeah. Going back also a little bit to perhaps to the reflection and journaling part where we started the conversation with.
Yeah.
Life in corporate organizations can be quite brutal, and I think we
Mm.
probably both have the scar tissue to prove it. What I like in that sense is, if I can quote from your book, is your statement that, and I quote now directly, experiences aren't truly yours until you think about them, analyze them, examine them, question them, reflect on them, and finally understand them. The
Yes.
point is to use your experiences rather than being used by them, to be the designer, not the design, so that experiences empower rather than imprison. I absolutely love that statement and that notion. Um, can you perhaps describe the how of this process? Perhaps by giving an example of a leader you coached or an experience you witnessed close by.
Yes. Well, and just a quick comment on that quote. I'm so lucky in my work in that I get to work with so many thought leaders, practitioners, and the quote's attributed to Warren Bennis, and I picked that up, and then I thought this thing about being um, not imprisoned by them is so important. In fact, I was using a different question from my book, which is about how do I grow my network to be effective. And I was with a group of CEOs, education business, and this illustrates that quite well in terms of the awareness. And I said, if you want to really grow your network, you have to ask two questions. The first one, independently, what do you most often get asked for help for? And this group wrote down their answers. And then the second question was, what would you like to be asked for help for? Now, when you've got these two lists side by side, you've got your network gap and influence gap. Because I think most work in organizations is in a amoral way, selfish work. People want to get work done quickly, efficiently. If Dirk's the person who always produces that spreadsheet, guess what, Dirk? You might be a great strategist, but they want to come for you for the spreadsheet. And so I was debriefing this. Now, this is a group of CEOs, and this one CEO, she said, I get asked for data all the time by the board. And I was quite surprised, and the group was surprised. And I always encourage the group to ask questions as well about the data. Okay. And then we held that and said, what would you like to get asked for help for? And she said, strategic direction, and actually seen as um, a convener of the discussion about direction. And I said, so what's this data thing? And she said, oh, I used to be head of global information systems and IT. So she'd stayed where she started in the dynamics of the organization, and now she was CEO of this institution. Yet they still saw her in this way of, oh, where's the data sheet now? Whatever it might be. She was so skilled at this, she was still providing this, but then missing out on this huge gap. But for me, then the aha moment for her, and she kind of commented later, is that awareness, just that one reflective practice question, unlocked for her her plan of, well, I ain't the person giving answers to data anymore. We've got a head of group IT, my successor. I will be deliberately, training the people who ask me these questions to that person and being very clear about where I am and can add value. So for me, this can be micro as well, but then by reflecting as a group, you might think the solution to an issue is our distributors, when actually the group comes to the conclusion the product needs an upgrade. So they can happen at the micro and the macro. But that example of the data CEO really struck me. But it was only the question that unlocked it in her. And she was almost, she hadn't even thought about it and was, but then it seemed to be an unlocking moment for her to own her own agency, if you like, and not be
Yeah,
defined as this data person.
yeah. A slightly different topic. In our pre-discussion, you mentioned that many leaders tend to outsource their problems.
Mm,
And I think we both exchanged experiences of business review meetings we attended where that felt more like forensic audits than, let's say, joint reviews of how the business was doing.
Hmm.
Um, how can we as leaders avoid the trap of outsourcing our problems? Do we need to change ourselves as leaders if we want to change others? And if so, how?
Well, let's understand what you mean by outsource because I've been thinking a little bit about that.
Yeah.
And it's worth your listeners having a look at the CEO report, which Side Business School published some years ago, but the data set is increasing all the time. Professor Michael Smets and Professor um, Tim Morris were the original architects of this, and they actually started to interview CEOs around, have you ever doubted yourself? And one of their conclusions is doubt is actually a resource, and you should actually proactively outsource doubt into tools like scenario planning because it gives you more options. So um, I think your choice as a leader is what am I going to outsource and what am I going to do myself? And I think that has to be the question. I don't think it's as black and white. Actually, I'm all for outsourcing some of your issues, particularly if they are community issues. That would be my
Hmm.
advice to people. But be aware of what you can outsource. I was really taken by the former CEO of the Wholesale Bank of Standard Chartered Bank, Mike Rees. He was quoting his coach, whose name I don't know, but let's share the question. He said the best question he was asked by his coach was, Mike, what is it that only you can do?
Hmm.
And I thought, wow, what a fabulous question. And
Yeah.
I think for me, that is the question of outsourcing with a little bit of reflective time of what is it, CEO, that only you can do? And when you've answered that question, you've got real clarity of what you might outsource and what you might not outsource.
Yeah. Yeah. Because one of the things that we also discussed was um, leaders actually inviting others to contribute to solutions, right? Because
Of course.
you have typically you have, let's say, where business reviews are taking place, and then what I said, they quite quickly take on a kind of forensic audit type of nature from
Yes,
why is
yes.
that product down? Why have you guys done this? Why is the
Yeah.
competition growing faster? Um, it's, let's say, a set of one-sided why questions, which the
Yes,
other
yes.
side then skillfully tries to pre-guess, and then it
Of
becomes
course.
more like a kind of role play in the sense of why the
Mm,
product's down. Well, we've basically got the answer for that. And why is the competition growing faster? Well, we have a slide for that one.
yeah.
Where it more becomes like a game than a rather a joint problem
Yes.
solving process. So what do you recommend teams to get into
Mm,
this kind of joint
great.
problem solving mindset?
Good. Well, again, it starts with a leader and their self-awareness, which is the leader's easy role in something like that, which is like an ops review, is it's almost a blame game. Why is it
Yeah.
down? What
Yeah.
happened? Why didn't it get to that distribution network?
Yeah.
Whereas a more generative approach would be, um, I can see some trends, they're concerning, and then back to the team. Um, could you convene a workshop on why these things are happening? I'm very happy to come along to that and let's understand the root cause. So apply some quality principles. But the people with the problem are the problem and the solution. And I think the more leaders recognize that, the more you can make much better momentum. So with that particular group, yeah, the sales figures for Q2, which are a problem, are still a problem, but the team leaves with a kind of empowered thing of, oh, we're going to start looking at some of the trends. We're going to look at some of the root cause analysis. We're going to perhaps jointly present that back with you, Vice President of Sales or whatever the title is, and we'll work it through because change in the marketplace often happens at the periphery and not the center.
Yeah.
And it's the weak signals which
Yeah.
are so prevalent in the market today. In fact, weak signals seem to be even more important now than they were even 5 years ago because of the complexity of technology, AI. And so by giving that work back, um, the sales figures are still down, but guess what? The team is more empowered and engaged than it ever was before. And I think there's a much better chance then of some quirky, weak signals to be shown to the group, and an experiment happens with whatever the route might. So that would be my,
Yeah.
but don't outsource the problem to the group of why is it down, fix it. That's a very authoritarian, old school. I wouldn't
Yeah.
even use the word leader. It's managerial at best.
Yeah, and it's also placing yourself deliberately out of the equation almost. It's
Yes,
like
yes, yes,
it's rather than let's say we put our collective brains together to solve a common problem. It's a matter
yes,
of you have a problem and what are you doing to solve it,
absolutely.
and then it very quickly becomes a
Mm,
game.
mm,
And also like your notions about, let's say that it happens never in the core, but always, let's say, something
mm,
at the periphery. It's
mm,
like I also heard that phrase 2 or 3 years back from a colleague who always told me it happens always at the fringes. These are
mm,
that's let's say
yes,
that's where let's say phenomena basically present themselves for the first time. And
absolutely.
yeah, what I also liked in the context of talent management is that you wrote reflective leaders grow more reflective leaders.
Mhm.
Is there a lesson here for the way that large companies design and conduct their talent management processes and succession planning?
Well, I think talent management, or particularly succession management, isn't an event, it's a process. And my final chapter is grow more leaders. And I think for you to have an easier life as an executive, you've constantly got to be growing more leaders. And I often get very specific about this. Yes, it could be the wonderful leadership program at Oxford or Harvard or Kellogg or wherever. But actually, it's in the micro moments of developing leadership, which is where opportunities get framed. It's also about giving the work back. And a tiny example I quote, and people have been using this a lot, is you might, for some reason, culturally, be always chairing some sort of meeting. Why not rotate the chairship of that meeting and let someone from the team manage um, the actual detail of the meeting? You then, as a leader, can relax around the process because the same questions will be asked. You're much more on the balcony, and you might be surprised that that team member you don't know so well runs a fabulous meeting, and they actually
Yeah,
feel quite good of, oh, I'm running the quarterly ops review or whatever the meeting might be. So leadership development is something which is a behavior again. It's in the moment, it's in the micro, and you can't do it without giving people headroom and elbow room to make decision making because it's decision making scope where leadership is forged.
yeah. As the head tutor of the Global Oxford Executive
Yes.
Leadership Program, how does reflection and experimentation shape the way that you design and deliver executive education at the site business school?
Well, um, it's fundamental, but a little comment about Side Business School. Of course, it's one of the Oxford colleges, and its deep assumption of developing leaders is based in the tutorial system, which was, developed in the kind of
Yeah,
1870s around, a student comes with a paper, and then I ask you, Dirk, to start the opening comment about um, discussing the paper that someone else has written or whatever, but you're challenging assumptions. And that's the foundation. So I would say it's embedded. This is an 8-week program. The program director, Professor Tim Morris, developed this with the Oxford team. As the head tutor, my role is to keep the momentum moving between the 8 weeks, and reflection is built into the program design, which is I encourage journaling. We have online constant tutorials, and we have a sort of two what we call live sessions where we have in real time participants and the program director and other faculty as necessary to then manage, and I then convene the live session. So it's deeply embedded. Also, there's a further development for me, which was before I was invited to be head tutor, I was very cynical of online learning as even possibly helping develop leadership. I've changed 360 degrees in my view. It absolutely has, and the alumni of that community is incredibly strong. Many of them in person now. It's a really rich, and it's a community of mutual helpfulness. But reflection is the underscoring principle of it. Whether it, and then you write a 500 word submission on one of the questions, which would occur every week. We often get the feedback, yeah, 500 words is quite difficult. Could we have 2,000 words or 1,000? And actually, the 500 is interesting because it really forces you to be
Yeah, yeah.
really
It's
concise in
great.
your thinking.
I think 500 words is extremely cruel.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is. It is.
it's almost too cruel. Yeah, I regularly, let's say, submit blog posts, etc., and they sometimes also have to fill this kind of 500 word. And I think
Yes.
it's cruel. It's really, you can't do that to people, but you do that anyway.
We do it and it works. That's the reason we do it because it forces people to really be clear about their assumptions. And there's almost a full journey of, oh, I'm now glad it was 500. So, yeah,
Super. Steve, thank you so much for this interview. I really
great. Well, I've
enjoyed it.
enjoyed it and always happy to discuss this. And thank you for your support and interest and your own curiosity, Dirk, which is a strong feature of your style. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll include all the details about the book and the program in the show notes.
Great. Thank you, Dirk.